I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines.
Hardcore Skeptic.
Okay, so I'm not really sure what to say to start this one off. I've been sitting on some of the interviews for my social justice series for a very long time. My intention was never to be sitting on them this long, but as time moved on and I got stuck working on one thing or another, these all just slid further and further down my to-do list. I can only apologize. I apologize to my guests. I apologize to my listeners. I hope that I've produced enough good content over the last couple of years to kind of make up for the fact that these fell by the wayside. But I don't know. For my guests, I don't really know how to apologize enough to make up for the time that they spent with me that didn't end up becoming an episode yet. Part of my head is still working on this larger project for this, and I make notes every now and then, but I still always fall behind because current stuff comes up and needs to get put out. I'm just really sorry that this all has taken so long to get out, and I don't know what else to say about it. Still, this interview with Callie Wright from the Gaytheist Manifesto was done back in April of 2016, and despite it being 2.5 years old, much of this stuff is still very relevant. The points Callie made and the stories that she told apply maybe even more so now after 2 years of backsliding into fascism and social conservatism. This pushback that we're seeing against social justice is, I don't know, I guess you could say troubling to say the least. But at the time that I did this interview, I thought we were making progress, and it seems like we haven't. It's a little funny when I'm listening to this, when I'm working on this, to hear how naive and ignorant I kind of was at the time of this recording. I just really didn't understand a lot of the issues that people in marginalized groups face. And while I'm still far from an expert on these things, I can attribute these interviews and much of the discussions that I've had over the last couple of years to a much clearer understanding of the issues. And generally, these discussions, these interviews, were a very important part of my turnaround in attitude on this subject of social justice. I went from somebody who kind of viewed all this stuff as kind of superfluous or like unnecessary, and instead I was very focused on the religious aspects, the anti-religion, the atheist movement, and skeptical activism. And since then, I've really become much more of a social justice activist, and my interest in social justice has grown over the years, the last couple of years, a lot. To the point where I actively think that without changing the systems that we have in society, we really can't achieve many good things, even in the anti-theist view or the pushback, like the push against religion and the atheist movement and the skeptical activism. Even that stuff can't progress unless social justice is tied into it. And even then, we still have to undermine many of the structures of power in our society and the hierarchies that we have going on right now. But that's just stuff that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I think you'll enjoy this interview, even though I think you might not even be able to tell that it came out 2 years, or like it was done 2 years ago. It might be obvious to some people, but it might not be so obvious if you don't know Callie well, or you don't know myself very well. I hope you enjoy it. I have a bit of a rant that I recently recorded that I'm going to put after the interview. It's a message to that sexist guy from your hometown, and I hope that publishing it as a blog and a video on YouTube, and perhaps putting it into this episode of the podcast might reach someone who needs to hear it or read it. And with that, I'm going to send you over to this interview with Callie Wright right after this promo for another podcast that you should check out.
Hey, everybody, we're the Utah Outcasts, and we want you to listen to our show.
We're a rowdy bunch of super liberal atheists that reside in the state of Utah, who bring you current events and featured content on a semi-weekly basis.
Whether it's us poking fun at the religious right or ranting at the world in which we all reside, we want to borrow your ears for about an hour twice a week.
Hey, and don't forget to tell them the best part about it.
Oh, yeah!
The show's free for all.
It is indeed, so if you like free, we're available through iTunes, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spreaker, Google Play, Patreon, and even in full HD video via YouTube. Give us a listen. You won't be sorry.
First off, why don't I get you to introduce yourself and get a bit of your background?
Sure. My name is Callie Wright. I host a podcast called The Atheist Manifesto. I'm also a public speaker, sort of educator, advocate for the queer and trans community. And I spend lots of time in the atheist and secular community trying to push LGBT allyship, specifically trans allyship, and then vice versa in the LGBT community, educating about atheism, secularism, and why our two communities are kind of natural allies for one another. As far as my personal background, I'm a trans woman. I've been out for 4-ish years now, and I've been an activist for most of that time. And it mostly started when Leela Alcorn died. If you're not familiar, she was a 17-year-old trans girl who committed suicide because her parents sent her to conversion therapy, isolated her from her friends, took away all her social media, and she ended up committing suicide because of that. And that event and the circumstances surrounding it, specifically the religious circumstances, are the things that really sort of pushed me into more than just being involved at a local community level, and more of a, I need to try and push this conversation in any communities that I have access to. And I listened to a bunch of atheist podcasts, was kind of marginally involved in the community at that point, but I decided that was the time to really start pushing things forward. And so started the Atheist Manifesto with a couple of friends, and it's just kind of taken off from there. And then so, I do the podcast every week, and then I do public speaking at conventions and meetup groups and that kind of stuff.
Very cool. So to you, what do you define social justice as?
Well, a lot of people, I think, confuse the terms equality and justice. And I think a lot of times people use those terms interchangeably, and I think that's a mistake. Because I think it might be best to define it by explaining what it's not first. So let's take abortion, for example, right? There is equality under the law when it comes to abortion, right? Every woman has the right to an abortion. Not every woman has access because of local laws that restrict access to facilities, where facilities can be, the different things that doctors have to do before they can perform an abortion. So there is the right, but there's not the access. The right is equality. Access is justice.
Right.
So the idea being, the goal of the social justice movement is to even those things out and to have not just equal rights, but equal access to society for marginalized people.
That's a slightly different way of explaining it that I've heard yet so far. That's pretty cool. So I guess is social justice a singular movement, or is it just a bunch of little movements? Or
I think any movement that's as broad as that is always going to have sort of different elements to it. I mean, if you look at the atheist movement, it's like that. There are people for whom atheism is their singular concern.
Right.
And their number one thing is refuting religion, arguing with apologists, church-state separation, that kind of stuff. All the things specifically related to atheism or secularism. And then there are atheists who, because of their atheist viewpoint, because of their secular viewpoint, they're interested in the other things that flow from that, because we know that religion has been, if not the number one, at least one of the biggest obstacles to marginalized people having equal access and equal rights in society. So I think that kind of takes it a step further. Instead of just fighting about something that we're against or defining ourselves based on something we're against, it becomes fighting for something, being explicitly for something. And this is what we're actually trying to accomplish, aside from saying, I want to get rid of religion or I want to eliminate religion's influence. It's not trying to take things away, but what are we trying to add? What are we trying to gain? What are we trying to get, if that makes sense? So yeah, and there are so many different areas in social justice, because when we say marginalized people, I mean, that's a broad umbrella, right? Because we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexuality, gender identity, disability, all of those different things. You're going to have different sort of sections of the movement focused on those things, because they're not entirely unrelated issues, but they definitely have their unique, their unique solutions, their unique problems, their unique ways of attacking those things. Right. So I think there's intersectionality and interconnectedness between all of them, but everyone has their niche, right? I mean, I do trans activism specifically because I'm trans. Right. I am an ally to my disabled friends. I'm an ally to my friends of color, but that's not what I spend the majority of my time doing, because that's not a fight that I feel like I should be leading, because that's not something that's that personal to me. I'm an ally in that sense. So yeah, I think there are, in a sense, sort of different movements that are partners, but not necessarily the same movement, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So yeah, so I guess, that can kind of lead into this other question of, how Dave Rubin likes to talk about an oppression Olympics. I wonder how does the different movements within social justice fall into that, or is there even such a thing as an oppression Olympics?
Oh, there's definitely such a thing. Something that we run into a lot is we have people who actually are doing the oppression Olympics thing, who just want to compete over how bad things are for them. The problem is that those people are taken to be representative of the whole, and that if you're talking about oppression at all, then you're playing oppression Olympics. Or people do really dismissive things and say, like, I got fired from my job for being gay. And it's like, well, what are you complaining about? At least you're not being thrown off a building for being gay. And those are the kinds of responses that we typically get, right? So people act as if you talk about discrimination and oppression at all, you're playing oppression Olympics, and it becomes a way to dismiss the valid concerns of people, right? Because obviously we know that being gay in the Middle East is a lot more of a hostile environment than most places in the United States, right? Like, I don't think any rational person would deny that fact. But when that becomes a tool to say that you're not allowed to talk at all about anything bad that's going on to you because you're gay, because you're trans, because you're black, that's when it becomes a problem, and it becomes weaponized to maintain the status quo, because people are uncomfortable with acknowledging privilege, with acknowledging that there are systems of oppression that exists. It's a tool to defend the status quo, basically.
Okay. You mentioned privilege. So what do we mean when we talk about privilege?
Privilege it's really when you're afforded considerations or rights or access because of something that you didn't earn. So, for example, I'll tell you a story to illustrate this example. Sure. My background is in audio engineering. I went to school to learn how to record bands. I spent 6 or 8 months paying my bills, running a recording studio. So I am not a world-class audio engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but I know what I'm doing. And there were a couple of Facebook groups that I was in that were audio engineering Facebook groups, and most of the people in there were way more knowledgeable than me. So I was in there to learn mostly. Right. Every once in a while, I'd throw in contributions or whatever. And whenever I would contribute, it would be a totally like, oh yeah, let's talk about this and how we do these things. No big deal. After I came out, my profile picture looked feminine. I changed my name. I tried to jump into one of these threads, and immediately, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Why would you even do that? Right. Oh my God, I bet all your stuff sounds terrible. And it blew me away because, I mean, this is the same Facebook group where I've jumped into many discussions, giving my perspective and saying, this is what works for me. This is how I do things, and had tons of pleasant conversations. And now all of a sudden that I'm presenting female, I present this opinion that is, I mean,
wow,
in the audio engineering world, the opinion that I presented was not an unpopular one. It was just, this is how I do things. And it was immediately just, I couldn't possibly know what I'm talking about. And I had everyone explaining to me things that I was very well aware of.
Right.
And I didn't even realize what was happening at first. And if that had only happened once, I could dismiss it as, that kind of thing maybe happens to everybody at some point or another. I don't know. But that sort of thing started happening to me a lot more in life. I would chime in, well, here's my thought, here's my opinion, and then, oh, no, you don't understand. You obviously don't get it. Here, I'm going to tell you how it really is. And so there's this idea that, if you're a masculine presenting person, or if you're a man, that your opinion is automatically more valid. And I will be the first to tell you that before I came out, I thought that was bullshit. When people would say that, I'm like, that doesn't happen, because I value everyone equally.
Right.
And then it started to happen to me. And I started to see people dismissing me when I would, express an opinion or try to be assertive or try to take charge. I noticed those things happening to me, and I didn't even believe that they existed before.
Right.
So that's what we talk about when we talk about male privilege is, the idea that you're automatically assumed to be better at being in charge. It's assumed that your ideas are more well thought out and more logical, and that, women think emotionally and men think logically, so we should listen to men more. And white privilege, when we're talking about dealing with the police, black people are typically always assumed to be up to no good, where white people usually get the benefit of a doubt. And I mean, these things play out across a million different situations. So it's, I don't know, that's a really long explanation, but I think a good way of saying it would be always having the best assumed of you because you're white, because you're straight, because you're a guy, because you're Christian, those kind of things.
Right.
Where if you're not those things, people are automatically more suspicious and more skeptical.
That sounds fair enough. I guess it kind of brought up a thought in my head, like where when you're a white man, you can be almost genderless and colorless because people see you for or they kind of see you for the things you do and the way you act, where if you're a woman or a person of color, they see that first rather than the things you do and the way you act.
Yeah, 100%. In the eyes of society, that's actually, I'm glad you said that because it brought this to mind. So I forget who said this. This is not an original thought, but somebody said basically if you're the average, white, straight, cis Christian guy, you have the advantage of being a blank slate in every situation.
Yeah.
People say, okay, I'm going to get to know you and not make any assumptions about you. They do for other things. I mean, based on the way that you dress or the way that you talk, like things like that. Like it's definitely a spectrum. It's not just
right.
As simple as, white, straight, cis, you get everything. It's not that simple. And anyone who says it is being disingenuous. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, people like that have the advantage of being able to be a blank slate. Whereas if you're black, if you're gay, and it's known that you're gay, if you're trans and it's known that you're trans, those kinds of things, whenever you go into a situation, typically you are dealing with people's preconceived notions and assumptions about you. You go into those situations with them automatically having an idea in their head that you have to fight against.
Right. How much of that do you think is based on or is unconscious versus stuff that's right at the forefront of their minds?
That's a really hard thing to say because so much of it is subtle cultural programming.
Right.
It simply because if you live in a bubble through no fault of your own, if, for example, you're a lower socioeconomic class, you live in the same town you've lived in your entire life, haven't had the chance to travel, haven't really been exposed to diverse groups of people. When you meet a black person for the first time, you're going to be like, what the hell's going on? Right. Right. So it's not even necessarily like if you're, skeptical and curious about that, it's not even necessarily your fault as a human being. You know what I mean? If that's your social conditioning and you've never been exposed to the fact that, there are people who look different than you and act different than you, So yeah, I think there's a lot of that. And then I think there's a lot of it that's overt as well. We still see people being taught that, if, black men are inherently angry and like anger is the only emotion they can feel and they're automatically up to no good. Or if you're trans, you're automatically this, deeply broken, mentally ill, just wreck of a person. And, I actually had somebody say to me once after I came out, like, I just had such a hard time believing you were trans because like you have your shit together so much in life.
Right.
The expectation was, the expectation was that I would just be so utterly depressed and so utterly broken as a person. Then I would come out and everyone would say, oh, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And part of that was like, well, I was good at hiding it because I was depressed and I was unhappy, but I was really good at hiding it. But the other part of it was too, is it's just these base assumptions that are programmed into us. And the person that said this to me is one of my best friends and who's been a big cheerleader of me through this whole process. So it's not a matter of him being a bigot or him, being mean-spirited. It was this idea that had been programmed into him by the messages that society sends, the stories that the media chooses to cover, the stories that you hear, through the grapevine. You don't typically hear about the trans person who comes out and is a brilliant success and lives a happy life, right? You always hear the sad story. So that's the idea that you get.
Right.
So, that's on a, sort of zooming out level. I think a lot of people on the sort of anti-SJW side, they personalize these things and they take it as a personal attack when we say there is this systemic bias against X group of people.
Right.
What they do is they think, well, I don't have that feeling, therefore what you're saying is crap. And what they're doing is they're personalizing it when we're making a comment about broader society. We all have these implicit biases. I have implicit biases about trans people and I am one.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I had to work past a lot of things when it comes to non-binary people that I was really skeptical of that at first until I met people and they took the time to educate me and I got to know people and I, learned and talked and that kind of stuff. So it's, when we say these things generally, and again, there are plenty of people who just like to yell and scream and feel superior and talk down to people. I don't want to act like that doesn't exist.
Right.
But at least in the circles that I run in, that's far more rare than most people think it is. But those are the examples people latch onto because those are the ones that make the idea itself easiest to dismiss, I think. But yeah, so it's a lot of cultural programming and sometimes it's overt. I guess that's a really long way to answer that question.
No, that's perfect. I was thinking, a lot of the times, like I've had a lot of conversations with anti-SJW types and, quite often, like you said, they latch onto this example or that example of bad behavior by so-and-so or this group of black people happened to act in a way that was discriminatory against a white person or whatever. They happen to have these examples. And they get really hung up on that. So what do you think is the best way to address that concern for those people when they get hung up on these examples?
Well, I think context is important because when we talk about oppression, discrimination, systemic bias, any of that kind of stuff, what is at the core of those conversations is who has the power, right? And that's why when you hear people say things like black people can't be racist or gay people can't be homophobic or trans people can't be transphobic, what that's a statement on, and I'll be honest and I'll say that I think a lot of the community maybe doesn't do a good enough job explaining this.
Right.
But what we're really saying there is when we talk about racism, when we talk about transphobia, when we talk about homophobia, oftentimes we are talking about the systemic problem of racism, the systemic problem of homophobia and transphobia.
Right.
And different things that people do to feed into those systems, right? And so when black people say, for example, that black people can't be racist, what they're saying is that black people can't feed into the systemic oppression of themselves. Generally speaking, obviously some can.
Right.
What they're not saying is that a black person can't discriminate or be prejudiced against white people.
Right.
That would be a silly thing to say. And I think there's a distinction that is made. And I think language prescriptivists are the ones that have the biggest problem with this, because even when we say things like, well, I'm talking about the systemic discrimination of trans people here, I'm not talking about your personal moral values, then they want to get into semantics about the words. And I'm like, can we just have a conversation about the concepts here? Like, I'm not insulting you. Once I let them know, like, I'm not insulting you as a human being.
Yeah.
If you felt that way, I apologize. That's not where I was coming from. Here's what I'm actually saying. They just want to move back to the thing again that's easy to dismiss and easy to straw man. And so when we say about, when we say things like that, we're talking about systems and who has the power. Trans people do not have the power. Black people do not have the power.
Right.
Gay people are maybe kind of getting there, but don't have the power. Women don't have the power. So, and that's why reverse racism, reverse discrimination is not really a thing when we're talking about it in that context.
Right.
Because I, as a trans person, am not part of a system that has the power to systemically discriminate against cisgender people. It's just not possible. Like, I can be mean to a cis person on a personal level simply because they're cis.
Right.
And that would be wrong of me. I'm not saying that that's an okay thing to do, but to say that that's the same level as a cis person doing that back to me, it's not, because they have the power in the situation. So we're talking about the locus of power in those situations. The way that I like to sort of distill it down is, if I'm mean to a cis person because they're cis, most of the time, the worst thing that's going to happen to that person is their feelings get hurt.
Right.
If a cis person is mean to me in one way or another, I could end up dead.
Right. Yeah,
so like,
it's quite a difference.
We can't pretend. Yeah, we can't pretend those are equivalent situations. And that's not a justification for being mean-spirited or prejudiced against anyone. But I do think it's a call to be a little bit more understanding. I hesitate to say this because I think a lot of people will take it the wrong way, but I can count maybe on both of my hands the number of cis people in my life who have never made me feel less than for being trans in one way or another, whether it was intentional or unintentional.
Right.
Most of the time when it happens, it's not coming from a mean-spirited place. It's not coming from a place where they're trying to be hurtful, right? Again, it's that cultural programming. It's innocent ignorance, right? But so when I say like, oh God, cis people, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
Or when black people say, oh God, white people, you know what I mean? Like, that's coming from a place where in their experience, they have had nothing but bad things happen to not only them, but their community at the hands of these kinds of people. And I think implicit in that statement is always like, yes, we understand that not all white people are the KKK. We understand that not all cis people are the American Family Association or whatever. Like, we get that. But I also think that when we're discussing these problems of oppression and discrimination and systemic bias, that we shouldn't have to have a 10-minute conversation qualifying what we say when we're critiquing that system, right? You know what I mean? Like, I want to say like, well, this is a thing that cis people do often. And before I can get out another word, everyone's like, well, not all cis people. I have a trans friend and I accepted her for who she is and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, dude, can I finish my sentence, please?
Right.
There's always like, we all understand that. And there's a strategy behind this too, because what happens is if we do qualify that, because again, a lot of this is cultural programming. It's implicit. It's not explicit.
Right.
A lot of times people don't even understand they're doing it. So again, this is not an attack on someone's character. This is a comment on the culture that we live in. When I say, for example, man, cis people do this thing to me all the time.
Right.
But, there are a lot of good cis people. Not everyone does that. Immediately, everyone who has those implicit biases and doesn't realize it says, I'm the last person she's talking about that doesn't have that issue.
Yeah.
Everyone immediately goes there. And it's an excuse to never examine your own implicit biases.
Right.
So it's tough because when you do that, it's challenging to someone, and cognitive bias is going to make that person dig in their heels, right?
Yeah.
We know from behavioral science that's a thing. But we also know that if you give someone an out in that way, they're going to take it no matter what, most of the time.
Yeah.
So just that's the general strategy behind that when we say, well, white people are racist or, cis people are transphobic, like those kinds of things. That's the strategy inherent in that. And that's the reason that they say things like that. It's not an attack on the personal character of each individual person. It's a comment on the way that our society programs us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's kind of related to this idea. What do you think of complaints that at certain rallies or certain events that people say things like, whites, you stay at the back and listen, or men, you stay at the back and listen when it's a feminist event? A lot of people seem to be getting really hung up on this idea where, oh, well, I might have something to contribute in this setting, so why can't I speak? So I wonder, what do you think of that?
It boggles my mind how hard it is for people to accept that something is not about them. That's kind of what it comes down to for me. Like, if we're talking about women's issues, women should be at the center.
Right.
If we're talking about Black Lives Matter, Black people should be at the center, right? Everyone else in that situation are allies, meaning that the people who are at the center of that conversation are the ones who should be leading. Now, that doesn't mean that no one else has anything to contribute.
Right.
But, what we end up hearing is that people aren't willing to listen, because I'll give a great example of this. So I mentioned earlier that my activism really kind of started around the death of Leila Alcorn.
Right.
And in the wake of that, there was a lot of attention surrounding the trans community. And we were thinking like, it's horrible and cynical to think this way. This terrible thing happened. There's nothing that we can do about it. But there's a lot of attention now. So how can we leverage this for the good of the community? How can we help people and make sure that this happens to fewer young people in the future?
Right.
And so there's an organization in Cincinnati that I won't name that, they're the only organization in Cincinnati that actually connects trans people with real resources.
Okay.
The other organizations are like, political activist organizations and those kind of things. And those things are important. I don't want to dismiss those things.
Right.
But if we're talking about connecting trans people with services that, get them into therapy, get them into, social services and that kind of stuff, this is the only organization that does this. And at the time they were running on a budget of like $3,000 or $4,000 a year.
Okay.
And so we were saying like, look, if you want to help, this organization needs your money. This organization needs your $5, $10, $15, whatever. Because, we can leverage this to do a lot of good. Like, we're on the ground saving lives in the community. And a lot of people listened to that. And a lot of people gave money to other organizations, which is fine. Organizations doing great work, and that's fine. I don't have any gripe with that. But there was a member of the community who is not trans who decided that his contribution was going to be that he was going to raise money to pay for a monument.
Okay.
Like a piece of stone carved with her name and a tree planted in a park somewhere.
Right.
And so, we all said like, look, that's a really great sentiment. Like, I appreciate the message that you're trying to send, but that's going to do zero to help keep trans kids alive in our community. That's not going to do anything to actually help our community. If you're able to raise this $2,500, which is the amount of money that he was trying to raise, like,
it's a good chunk of change, actually.
Yeah, like, it's unimaginable the amount of good that we can do with that money, aside from carving somebody's name into a rock and sticking it in a park somewhere.
Right.
And he's on the news talking to people, and I was on the news a couple of times, but like, this is a person who is not trans on the news speaking on our behalf, who is acting in a way contrary to what we have said our needs are.
Right.
Right. But he had it in his head that, oh, this is my idea. This is how I'm going to help. This is what I'm going to do. No one in the community thought this was a good idea. No one in the trans community anyways.
Right.
Everyone was telling him like, oh my God, this organization is helping keep people alive. They need this money. And I had a phone call with the guy and I was like, listen, I appreciate what you're doing. I love where your heart's at, but our community is hurting. People are at risk. People are dying. And that money will go further than you can imagine to save lives and improve lives.
Right.
Like, we don't need a monument in a park somewhere. We need this. And he acted like he understood. And then he was on the news 3 times the next day promoting this monument.
Oh, jeez.
And then the monument never materialized. After he raised the $2,500, the monument never came together.
Oh, jeez.
He says that he donated the money to an organization because he wasn't able to make the monument happen or something like that. Obviously, we have no way to verify that.
Right.
But so, and we see that across communities, right? We see someone who is well-meaning, who says, you know what, I just learned about this whole trans thing. I think they're getting a raw deal. I want to help. So instead of coming into the community and listening and learning, they immediately say, well, here's all my ideas. I know how to fix your problem.
Right.
You know, I watched this one movie about racism and I know exactly how to fix racism now. And I'm going to tell all you black people who have been doing racial justice organizing and activism for years, you know, I'm new to this thing, but I'm going to tell you all how it's done.
Right.
You know, like that's the dynamic.
Yeah.
So when they say, if you're a Black Lives Matter rally, probably only black people are going to be speaking. Black people will be at the front and center. On a level, I understand why people have a problem with that.
Right.
But I think it's really hard sometimes for us to let go of the fact that this space is not about us. You know, this space is about black people and how we can help, not how we can lead, not how we can take control, but how we can help. And if you're listening to all of those people in the center, if you're listening to all of those people speaking and up front, then you're going to learn what you can do and what you can contribute. So you come into the situation saying, what do I need to learn and how can I help? Here's what I have to offer. How can you plug me in?
Right.
That's not the conversation that happens oftentimes. The conversation oftentimes happens, well, I had this idea and here's what I think you should do. And when they're like, well, that doesn't really work because this, it's like, well, then why are you pushing your allies away? You don't want to listen to people who want to help you.
Right.
You know, and I mean, like, it sounds cheesy, but I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, I've had so many conversations with people who have figured out how they're going to fix trans issues. And,
right.
and again, it's a cis person, well-meaning. They're not a terrible person.
Right.
You know, they figure out like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I didn't know this was happening. And all of a sudden they know how it's going to be fixed and they want to tell trans people how to do it. And when trans people are like, no, that doesn't work. They're like, well, they obviously just don't want help then. They obviously don't want to fix their problems. You know, there's no acknowledgement or recognition of the fact that there are people who have been doing this stuff for decades, know very well what they're doing and have a track record of success. All of that gets thrown out the window because me, cis person, me, white person, I have the answer.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, you just got to understand that some spaces are not about you. Some spaces are not about me. And there's a time to lead and there's a time to step back.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I wonder, often wonder sometimes if people just are so caught up in being heard that they forget how to listen. It's
yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's kind of a universal human thing, right? I don't think that marginalized people are any less prone to that. As a matter of fact, we may be more prone to it because we listen to so little.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I mean, I can't count how many times I have seen non-trans people on the news speaking for us and saying problematic things. You know, it would be a different story because, you know, using your privilege is a great thing. If, you know, a cis person is speaking out on trans rights, that can in some ways be more powerful than me speaking out on trans rights because of course I'm going to do it, right? I'm trans. I have a vested interest in this. So an ally speaking on behalf of the community, you know, someone saying, you know, I started in a place where I didn't agree with this and I thought it was bad. And here's what I learned.
Right.
And here's where I'm at now. That can be super powerful, but it has to come from a place of listening to and understanding the community and amplifying those voices with your own. And instead of just making it about you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's unfortunate, but like we've kind of touched on it before, but white cis straight dudes get listened to. So if we can support people then and like without trying to impose ourselves on people, then maybe we can do some real good in a public sense.
Well, yeah, and I think entitlement is probably the right word. And again, when when I say that, a lot of people immediately think like that's a personal attack on them.
Right.
And I mean, maybe it could be, depending on the person, but again, it's cultural programming, right? From the time that you are in class as a kindergartner, your environment is teaching you that your perspective and your voice is more important than the others.
Yeah.
So like, of course you're going to grow up to think that. You know what I mean? So it's, again, it's something that I think people should take personal responsibility for, but it's not one of those things where I think it's like your individual fault for ending up that way if you're a person who ends up that way, if that makes sense.
Right. It's the way we're socialized more so than any necessary choices we're making.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So I guess I might change gears a little bit here. What are your thoughts on this concept of identity politics that so many people are pushing back on?
Anyone who thinks that they don't do identity politics is full of shit. That's my first thought. Because, you know, I mean, everyone on the right who was crowing about identity politics were the same ones who were saying, well, I'm white and I'm working class and I've been forgotten about.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? It's just, it's hilarious to me that there are people who think that they don't play identity politics. Like, your perspective, your politics, your opinions are by definition going to be informed by who you are as a human being and those different aspects of yourself. So, you know, in one way or another, if you're white, that's going to influence the way that you navigate the world and the way that you see the world. If you're trans, if you're cis, if you're straight, if you're a person of color, et cetera,
right.
And generally speaking, you're going to make decisions about who you vote for, you know, the issues that you vote for based on those things, even if it's not explicit. So, you know, that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is that I think it's a matter of privilege, right?
Right.
Because when you hear someone like Bill Maher say that trans issues are a boutique issue that we can set aside for a minute,
right.
I'm thinking to myself, that's my fucking life.
Yeah.
You're talking about. Like this is not some academic debate that exists in a vacuum that has no real world consequences for the rest of us. This is literally my life. You're asking me to set aside concerns about the quality of my life to advance your agenda.
Right.
Like that's what you're telling me that I have to do. So, you know, I should put off concerns that I may not be able to get married to my girlfriend. I should put off concerns that I could end up in jail for pissing in the wrong place.
Right.
I should put off concerns that it's legal in the state that I live to be fired for being trans. I should put aside my concern that the property manager at my apartment could be like, I don't like that you're trans, get out of my apartment, and I would have no legal recourse.
Right.
You're asking me to set all of that aside to push your agenda. Like, that's when people cry about identity politics, that's literally what they're saying.
Right, eh? So I guess you don't buy into the idea that the left, or quote unquote the social justice warrior side of things, are the ones dividing people up.
I don't think that it's a left-right thing dividing people. I think it's social programming that divides people. Because, like, let's take, for example, the fact that I'm left-handed, right?
Right.
No one in the world would know that I'm left-handed unless they saw me write, or they saw me, you know, play guitar, or I don't play guitar left-handed, but if they saw me write, if they saw me like throw a ball or something like that, they would know that I'm left-handed. But even knowing that I'm left-handed, that's not something that's stigmatized in our society, so nobody cares, right? That technically makes me a minority because most people aren't left-handed, but also no one gives a shit if you're left-handed, right? So that's not part of my identity, being left-handed, aside from some jokes about my hands being sore because there was never scissors for me at school.
Right.
But being trans, by necessity, changes the way that I navigate the world in a way that a cisgender person does not have to navigate the world. Right? So if I go to a doctor and say, I'm trans, I want hormone replacement therapy, and they're like, I think that means you're mentally ill. I'm not going to feed into your mental illness. Go see a therapist. I'm going to commit you to a mental institution, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all things that happen, by the way.
Right.
If I simply respond by saying, I'm just a human being, guy. Like, I'm just a person. That's not an argument. That's not convincing to someone because they automatically see me as the other because I'm trans. And you can say the same for any marginalized group, right?
Right.
So it's these implicit biases that are programmed into us all that create those divisions. You know, I think kind of what you're getting at is that a lot of people on the right or on the anti-SJW side, like a lot of classical liberal people, a lot of times what they say is by talking about these things, you're creating more division.
Yeah.
By, talking about yourself as a trans person, as a woman, as a black person, et cetera, that you're creating those divisions. And that, I mean, it's just fucking ludicrous. Like, I don't know if you're trying to keep this PG-13.
No, I couldn't do that
okay.
if it was my goal, I wouldn't be able to.
Okay. Fair enough. But yeah, I think it's fucking ludicrous because what other problem have we ever solved by ignoring it?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like how are we going to solve literally anything if we simply ignore it? And these are usually the same people who say things like, I don't see color, or I don't see race,
right.
or I don't see gender, while they're doing horribly problematic things around those things that tell me they obviously do see it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, like I said, it's a lot of cultural programming. I don't want to be that person that's like, they're all terrible people, that kind of thing. I think it's helpful to separate the consequences of someone's behavior from who they are as a person sometimes.
Yeah.
Because I like to think of myself as a generally good person. I'm compassionate. I care about people. That doesn't mean I'm incapable of doing something hurtful to someone else.
Right.
Because of ignorance, because of implicit bias, any of that kind of stuff. And I think that's true for literally everyone. The key, I think, is being able to discuss those things honestly without having the knee-jerk reaction of, well, I had a trans friend come out and I accepted her totally, so I'm a perfect ally.
Right.
And that sounds like a straw man, but I hear like some permutation of that conversation all the goddamn time.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how you approach it. That's the other thing. A lot of people will tell you like, well, your approach should be different. You shouldn't yell at people and be mean to people. And like on a level, I get that, but I also have a ton of experience with these conversations. And generally speaking, most of the time, it does not matter how you approach the conversation.
Right.
If you're gentle, oftentimes they won't respect you and they will dismiss you. If you're angry and aggressive, they will dismiss you because you're being angry and aggressive and not being rational and thinking things through.
Right.
They will find a reason to dismiss it because they're not actually interested in the conversation. They're interested in buttressing their own view. And again, that's a cognitive bias, not necessarily a character trait.
Right.
And honestly, the fact that I have to keep making that qualification is a sign of all of this. Just like throwing that out there.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter if I say something as innocuous as even in like a private message, like not even calling somebody out publicly. In a private message, I can say, hey, that thing you said, like that was kind of hurtful because X. So, if you could, just try not to address me or other people that way, like that would be awesome. Something as innocuous as that can be met with, well, I'm just trying to learn. Like, why are you pushing away your allies? I mean, I have had that conversation repeatedly. I mean, even approaching it in a very sort of ginger, soft hand-holding way like that.
Right.
And then the other thing to understand is coming from a place of privilege, I think that everyone expects a conversation surrounding trans issues, surrounding race issues, etc., to be about changing the other person's mind. So when someone is being horribly racist and black activists come in or even white allies come in and are being aggressive and are yelling at this person and saying these things, looking from the outside from a privileged position where these things don't actually affect your life, you can think like, well, gosh, they're not doing much to change minds. They're not doing much to help their cause.
Right.
What they don't understand is that not every conversation is about changing someone's mind. Sometimes a conversation is about protecting your people. So if I have someone who's being horribly transphobic to a friend of mine and saying very hurtful things to a friend of mine who's already in a vulnerable position in life, my goal is not to change that person's mind. My goal is to draw a circle around the person being hurt and push the other person the hell out of it by whatever means possible. And I think a lot of people miss that nuance too. My job is not always to change someone's mind. Honestly, my first job is to protect my people where I can.
Right.
My second job then is to sort of go out into the world and try and change those minds and try and lessen the need for that protection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I wonder, because sometimes when people are called out for problematic behavior, they'll get defensive, and I guess you kind of touched on that. And I guess I have myself been guilty of, when somebody I know has been called out, I will sometimes defend them as though they didn't do anything wrong. And I think it speaks to the same thing. Like when you have somebody that you think is like your friend or your person, and you feel like they're being attacked, even if they're not necessarily being attacked, you really jump to their defense to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a natural reaction, right? I mean, we don't want to feel like our character is being attacked. We don't like seeing our friends attacked. And that's, that's a natural reaction. I read this really great article. The title of it escapes me at the moment, but it basically talks about how toxic call out culture can be.
Okay.
And, call out culture initially, to my understanding, started as a way for activists to hold each other accountable.
Right.
And to say, like, you need to be better at doing this. You need to be better at doing this. So it was, at the end of the day, it was meant to be a positive thing.
Right.
It was meant to be like, you're committed to doing this thing. I'm going to hold you accountable to doing this thing.
Yeah.
But what it's turned into in a lot of circles as an excuse for people to grandstand, an excuse for people to prove how much better of an SJW they are than everyone else, and to prove how culturally competent they are, and speak down to people who are obviously less so.
Right.
A lot of times it's hard to tell the difference between the good kind and the bad kind,
right.
if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I personally advocate a lot more for call-in culture. And when you call someone in, instead of putting them on blast publicly,
right.
and humiliating them and immediately putting them on the defensive, I try to engage that person privately.
Okay.
And just sort of have a one-to-one conversation. And this is, I've been on both sides of this issue. People message me privately to say, hey, this thing that you said really hurt me, and here's why. And I've done the same thing with other people. And I've been convinced through various means that this is at least the best first step.
Right.
That doesn't mean you do this every time. If someone's continually being hurtful and continually being awful, obviously you
right.
step your game up and escalate a little bit. But I'm a big fan of this kind of thing. I mean, and it depends on how egregious it is, obviously. I mean,
fair.
I saw someone on Facebook straight up saying that if you're a woman who works at Fox News, you probably deserve to be sexually assaulted.
Oh, geez.
That's a person I'm not going to engage politely with under any circumstances, because that's just disgusting.
Yeah.
So that one, I didn't even really know the guy that well, so I just unfriended him.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing where you just go, oh, this is not a person worth my time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But if it's if it's more subtle things, asking things about trans people, or saying things about trans people that are problematic, but they maybe don't necessarily understand that they are.
Right.
I'm much more of an advocate of the gentle sort of private approach, at least at first. Because I think when you make it a private conversation as opposed to something in public, there's less pride at stake. There's less, reputation stuff at stake.
Right.
So I generally think that's the better way to go about things in most situations. Obviously, it depends on exactly what the situation is.
Yeah, no, that actually speaks to a lot of the interactions I've had on social justice lately. Is like people really think that the whole call out culture, the whole thing, is really toxic, and they it's like you said, it's hard to always know the difference between somebody who's just being a keyboard warrior or what have you, or virtue signaling or whatever, versus somebody who's a genuine ally who's really trying to bring your own awareness up. So, yeah.
Well, and I think the thing to understand about that, coming from the side of someone who, especially someone who means well, someone who's trying to be an ally, there's kind of two things that I would say to that. The first being, obviously no one wants to be in a space where you're continually being shit on, right? Regardless of how much you care about an issue, if you're in a space where people are only talking badly about you, that's not a space you're going to want to be in, no matter how much you care about an issue.
Right.
But I've also seen people say things like, I cared about trans issues until I had this conversation with you, and it makes me not want to care anymore.
Right.
So that tells me that the reason that you cared before had nothing to do with the real problems that trans people face.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like if one trans person being mean to you makes you not care about the cause, you didn't care about the cause in the first place. So stop lying to yourself and stop lying to everyone else.
Right. Yeah. I saw a meme about that too. Like, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
Where it was like if a black person saying, well, I don't like white people, or like you say, like a trans person saying, I don't really like cis people today, or whatever, makes you abandon allying with them at all, then there's something else going on there.
Well, yeah, and that doesn't mean that you're obligated to continue engaging with that person specifically or engaging in that space specifically.
Right.
Because again, like nobody wants to be in a place where they're constantly being shit on. I get that. But I mean, if it makes you abandon your care for the cause completely, then you never really cared in the first place.
Right.
The other side of that is to remember that these frustrations are not academic, right?
Right.
If I have a friend who's disabled, and I mean, we've spent hours and hours and hours talking about all of the awful ways they've been treated by people because of their disability.
Right.
And when they see something on Facebook that's problematic about disabled people, the context is not just that one statement. The context is their entire life of being shit on because of their disability.
Right.
So of course they're not going to feel super charitable and want to respond with kindness and hand-holding to something like that.
Yeah.
Because this is something that has negatively affected their life for almost their entire life. And I think that's the other thing that people on the other side of this need to realize is that, a really good way to illustrate this, without just saying it specifically, is the idea when someone comes out as trans and well-meaning people, they get the name wrong, get the pronouns wrong, that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Any reasonable person, when they come out, they understand that people are going to make mistakes, right? I've been out for 3 or 4 years now. It still happens sometimes with the people closest to me. And I was more tolerant of it at first because obviously this is new, right? And I know that when a friend accidentally uses my old name or accidentally uses the wrong pronouns, I know that's not coming from a bad place. I understand that they're not purposely trying to be mean. That doesn't mean I'm not allowed to be hurt by it. And that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to express that hurt and that frustration.
Right.
Those two things can exist simultaneously.
Yep.
And a lot of times what I see is someone will make a mistake and they will apologize. And they will expect that to be 100% the end of the conversation. And they'll expect things to move forward as if nothing ever happened.
Right.
And it's like, especially when I first came out, what I would tell people is like, you got to understand, this is not the first time this has happened to me today. This is not the first time this has happened to me this week. So my interaction with you is not the only context in which this issue affects me. So just like you want me to be understanding of you when you make mistakes, you have to be understanding of me when I'm upset by them and I can't immediately just push it off like it never happened.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of times from the other side of things, there is that expectation that because I'm trying, no one should ever be upset by what I do.
Yeah. And it seems, that's interesting because like you say, like a person has their feelings and is going to be upset, and that's just the way it is, and they're allowed to feel those things, and we really, just because we're trying doesn't negate those feelings.
Well, yeah, perfect example of this. I was at work and I was sitting there signing in as I was getting into work, and somebody that I work with had a picture of a really, really hot girl on his phone. And went to show it to one of my coworkers. And I mean, he was literally just like, oh my God, this girl's hot. Check it out. I mean, that was the point of the conversation.
Right.
And immediately the person he was showing it to was suspicious and was like, oh, that's a dude, isn't it?
Oh.
And I turned around and I was like, I'm sitting right fucking here, dude. Do you not understand?
Right.
And I didn't say anything at first just because I was so shocked by it. And I could tell the person who was showing him the picture was shocked by it too. Like he didn't expect that. And it was just like, I mean, that was a terrible way to start my workday because I see work as a very safe place for me. Like everyone there is super friendly to me. I've had so few negative experiences there. I really let my guard down when I'm at work.
So then when it happens, it's
exactly.
Yeah.
And then probably 5 or 10 minutes later, he was like, "Hey, Callie, can we talk?" And I was like, "Yeah, we need to talk." and so we went off privately, and he apologized profusely.
Right.
He's like, it's one of those things. He's like, that kind of shit's been programmed into me. I've been trying to get better. I spoke before I thought, and like, I know why this is really hurtful to you, and I'm really sorry. And I was just like, yeah, you should feel bad. Like,
right.
you understand why that was so hurtful to me, right? Like as a trans person, like, do you see me like that? There's another trans person that we work with. Do you see her like that?
Right.
There are people that I work with that are trans but not out that I know about, and like, you say that kind of shit around them, it makes it harder for them to come out. Like, you understand on all the levels why this is not a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, I totally get it. I'm really sorry. And he's like, "Are we okay?" And I was like, "Not yet. I need time."
Yeah.
And his response to that was, "I get it. It's okay."
Yeah.
And it's fine, right? And I mean, and I love the guy to death, right? He's not a terrible person. He's a great guy.
Right.
But again, it's that implicit bias, cultural programming. I'm not sure that he ever knew a trans person before he worked with me or the other trans woman that we work with. So it's something that he's learning about. But he was also understanding that when he made that mistake, I was like, "We're going to be okay, but I need some time."
Right.
And he said, totally understand that. And like, I'm really going to try to be better. Like, that's the way those interactions should go.
Right.
You know what I mean? As opposed to like, "Well, I said I'm sorry." You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that what you did wasn't hurtful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the opposite of how things go online, like, all the time. Hey.
Right. Yeah.
I guess we're getting pretty close to an hour here. I could probably talk to you for a long time if we had the time. Yes. I got 2 questions that I've asked at the end of every interview. The first one is, what is something you wish everyone would realize about social justice?
I think the biggest thing is that it's not monolithic. Like, the social justice movement is not monolithic.
Right.
And that I wish people would stop taking those examples of bad behavior and painting the entire idea of social justice with them. Yeah. I think that would be my main thought. That
seems fair to me. We didn't even get to touch on any of the college campus stuff that people have talked about. And the last question is, if you had to criticize your own side or your own way of behaving or dealing with people you disagree with, what would that criticism be?
I actually think the biggest thing that I see that I wish that people might do differently, and honestly, I see this in almost anyone who has an opinion and anyone who tries to convince anyone of anything on any side.
Right.
I see it on my side, and I think it's one of those things that we can say, like, you know, one side disproportionately does one thing, one side disproportionately does another thing. I think this is a thing that is pretty equally bad on all sides. So maybe that's why it's okay to say it's about everyone instead of specifically the side that I'm on.
Right.
It's the fact that I think a lot of times people choose ways of engaging in activism that feel good to them as opposed to the ones that are effective.
Yeah.
So, you know, I talked earlier about, you know, the idea that when we engage in activism, our number one goal isn't always to change someone's mind. Sometimes our goal is to protect people. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. Obviously, you know, I don't think anyone should be obligated to have, you know, one specific goal or another.
Right.
But I think a lot of people have themselves convinced that they're doing the mind-changing thing when what they're really doing is the thing that feels best to them. So I see this most often, I think, in the atheist movement. I mean, I see it everywhere, but I think I see it most often in the atheist movement when atheists engage with believers.
For sure.
You know, they throw out all the refutations of Pascal's wager, and they throw out all the science and all the logic and all that kind of stuff, and they do it in a really condescending and superior way. And I just think to myself, like, what do you actually think you're accomplishing here?
Right.
You know, because that person is convinced that this is the way they're going to change someone's mind, with presenting them with the evidence. And presenting people with evidence is not a bad thing, but how you deliver it counts.
Yep.
And I see a lot of that. Like, well, I've done my atheist activism for the day. And it's like, no, you've done your grandstanding for the day.
Right.
Like, let's be real, you know? And I also see it on the other side of people who engage solely diplomatically and have, and always have a soft touch, always have a soft approach, and are afraid to escalate or be aggressive at all.
Right.
They do that same thing because, again, we know that there are some people who are not going to respect you unless you're aggressive in one way or another.
Yeah.
But just like the person who grandstands feels really good about themselves for grandstanding because they feel like they've accomplished something, the person on the hardcore diplomat side feels the same way. They feel good about themselves because of what they've done. They may not necessarily be able to point to the fact that they accomplished something, but they can feel good about what they did.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be more explicit about what our goals are when we enter that kind of activism. Are we trying to protect our people? Are we trying to give affirmation and support to people? Are we trying to change minds? Are we trying to draw lines around ourselves to protect ourselves? You know, those kinds of things. I think we could probably be better about communicating those things and be better about being real about whether or not what we're doing is actually accomplishing those goals.
Right. No, that's a really good answer, actually. I can think
and
of
call out culture.
I can think of
but I think that's part of it.
Right. Yeah, it's like you say, they're doing what feels good to them, and yeah. So I guess, where can people find your stuff?
You can find the blog at thegaytheistmanifesto.com. That redirects to our Patheos blog. You can find the show on iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. And I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter.
Awesome.
And Callie Wright on Facebook.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great conversation. It's way different than the conversation I usually have, which means it was a lot of fun.
Right. Awesome. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no worries. Take care.
Have a good one. All right, so that's the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. Before I send you to my rant, which is my message to that sexist guy from your hometown, I want to remind you to check out Callie's content. She recently put out an episode discussing the new rules against nudity and adult content on Tumblr. And the Gaytheist Manifesto is a must-listen every episode, with great stories and an amazing format that sounds like it takes a ton of work. Definitely, Callie, the Gaytheist Manifesto deserves your support. I'll provide as many links as I can in the show notes, but if you're listening to this on a podcast player, then just go to your search function on your podcast app or whatever, and hit it, enter the Gaytheist Manifesto, and download the latest episode. It's really worth the listen, and support everything Callie does. After that, this is now I'm going to send you over to my latest rant, a message to that sexist guy from your hometown. This is a message for that sexist friend from your hometown. We all have them, those friends we keep because we grew up in the same place. We might nod and say hi if we see them in public, but we don't really hang out with them. We keep them as friends on Facebook so we can see what's going on and what the general mentality of our hometown is, or out of some strange sense of loyalty. It almost feels like a betrayal to unfriend them or block them. I mean, they were cool at one point, and surely they must be cool now, too. Well, not all of them are, and this is a message for those friends from our hometown who for one reason or another have held on to those sexist ideas, or really any of the outdated and bigoted ideas that they hold on to. I'd like to start with a question. Does your girlfriend or wife think it's funny when you make fun of women drivers? Does she agree with you when you say that women aren't as smart as men? I'd guess probably not. You laugh and say that you don't mean her, but she just nods and keeps doing things. And she thinks you're a good enough man in other ways that she can look past this little bit of misogyny. But that's the same thing that ends relationships eventually. It dehumanizes her and all women. It takes away her dignity and their dignity, and for what? Does it make you feel superior? Do you actually think that you're superior? If you're a man of any age under 80, you should realize by now that women are not inferior to men. They can perform at the same level as men in everything short of growing back hair. And that's not a particularly good measuring stick. I want you, my friendly hometown misogynist, to really think about this. Why do you think that you can denigrate women and think you're still doing nothing wrong? I don't know the answer. I used to push back on feminism. I didn't think it was necessary. Women were obviously equal to men, and all this nonsense about systems of power that hold women back didn't make sense to me. Rape culture was a misunderstanding about who was doing the raping. Jokes about women being dumb or bad drivers or whatever were just jokes, and men who were actually sexist were few and far between. But I was wrong, and if you think those things, then so are you. Take a look at some of the comment sections on videos done by women, or check out the replies to women on Twitter. It's not just a matter of men disagreeing with women. They call them names, threaten to rape them, and accuse them of dishonesty even when they're just saying the obvious. Women online are subject to sexual advances no matter what they are working on, no matter what they're wearing, and no matter what age, race, or sexuality they are. They're subject to it just because they're women online. I can't imagine you would think it's okay for some dude to walk up to your wife and whip out his dick or hit on her and call her a bitch when she rejects him. If it's not all right to do in real life, then it's not all right to do online, because online is real life. And it's not just online. Women have to deal with catcalling, harassment, demeaning jokes, and sexual advances every day in their lives offline as well. This isn't some myth spread by third-wave feminists. It's extremely common, and the experiences have been expressed by probably every woman you know. If you haven't heard of it, then that usually means that they don't trust you enough to tell you, or they just don't think you'll believe them. Would you? Would you be the guy who thinks she should be super nice to someone who won't take no for an answer? Would you believe her when she tells you that she was catcalled 30 times walking down the street? I personally know women who have felt uncomfortable ordering a pizza because they don't know what kind of person the delivery guy might be. That might seem over the top if you haven't heard some of the stories that women share about this stuff, but it's a legitimate concern if you know that there are enough men who are rapists to scare women away from trusting men at all. It's not just the rapists, which could include everyone from neighbors, friends, delivery guys, landlords, or pretty much anyone. It's also the apologists, men who find it necessary to defend every guy who's accused of rape by announcing that they once heard about a false accusation that one time, or they share an article on Facebook. All of this stuff together doesn't even scratch the surface of the world women face. There's also a system of power that favors men and questions and over-scrutinizes everything women say or do. When women say or do something that men think is good, men take credit for it and pretend it was their idea. And this is another well-documented occurrence, particularly in the workplace. Just ask the women in your lives if some of them have experienced some of these things. Not everything is universal, but the number of women who experience this stuff is far too high. It's hard to deny the sheer number of instances of men getting promoted over women or the number of rape cases that go unpunished. I'm not saying rape and not getting promoted are the same thing, but they are both symptoms of systemic issues involving men having power over women and those women being failed by that system because of it. I'm not sure how to end this message, but to the sexist dude from my hometown, you need to really think about the way you see the world. When someone challenges your perception of things, you need to actually stop and try to understand why you see things the way you do instead of getting defensive and acting out. Instead of telling a woman who disagrees with you to go get you a sandwich and showing yourself to be a misogynist and frankly not very creative, maybe try to understand her point. Do this with all things, not just with sexism. When someone tells you that the meme you shared is transphobic, try actually thinking about what gender is and why you feel the need to keep it in a binary. When somebody tells you that you shouldn't use the N-word instead of telling them to get over it, maybe try to understand the history of what that word means and why it matters and why it's hurtful. This and so many other things need to be worked on by you and by me and by society in general. You can stay in your hometown. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. You don't need to change a bunch of things about your life necessarily. But you still do need to grow as a person, and you need to do better when dealing with people who are different than you. I want to stay friends with you. I want to be justified in maintaining a bond with you, even though it may be tenuous. And I'm not saying that I'm perfect, because I'm far from perfect. I mean, hell, I've still got you on my friends list, even though you post some pretty shitty things, and even though you say some pretty shitty things. Someone with less privilege than I have might not be willing to or able to put up with your sexism or racism or bigotry. But I do. I have that privilege, and I can put up with that. But even I have my limits. And I hope that you can work towards being a better person so that you and I can stay friends and work towards building a better world together. All right, that's it for the episode. Thanks for listening. For all the things, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com or on our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, Kim, Kalik, Stephanie, Zach, the Utah Outcasts, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Bob Glenn, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave, Positively Skeptical, Rob, the Podunk Polymath, the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Sauce Be Upon Him, Freethinker215, and Larry. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Or you can do a one-time donation at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. And of course, you can go buy stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. Whew. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi for doing the intro voiceover. You can find his podcast at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our Patreon ad, which I don't think I played this episode. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. And maybe subscribe your random relative who has a podcast app on their new phone to our show. Anyway, thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.